All right, so we got some pretty alarming updates coming out on the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine in terms of how big of a risk we are currently at of this escalating to a broader conflict or even a nuclear confrontation between the United States and Russia, or basically launching us into World War III. So, basically, Joe Biden was at a fundraiser last night for the Democratic Party, and he made some statements about where he assesses that risk to currently be. So let's go ahead and jump into this here from Caitlin Collins. She says, wow, Biden at a Dem fundraiser tonight. We have not faced the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. He says Putin is not joking when he talks about the potential use of tactical nuclear or biological weapons because his military is underperforming. They go on to say, I don't think that there's any such thing as the ability to easily use a tactical nuclear weapon and not end up with Armageddon. He says Biden is going much further than his officials have, from the National Security Council to the Pentagon. They have said that they take Russia's threats seriously, but haven't seen any changes to its nuclear posture. And Biden invokes Armageddon and says that Putin should be taken seriously. Okay, so a number of different things here. First of all, off the bat, this is not something that's really surprising. We already kind of knew that, we are obviously marching closer and closer towards the prospects of this escalating towards a broader confrontation between Putin and the West, or, escalation towards the use of nuclear weapons, even if they are quote unquote tactical nuclear weapons. Now, part of the reason why I think that this is important that Joe Biden is coming out and saying this is because, again, he's saying that we are closer to Armageddon, meaning we are closer to global war. We are closer to World War III and the escalation of the United States getting involved militarily in this war. And basically my takeaway from this type of a statement is that if Vladimir Putin were to decide to use some sort of a tactical nuclear weapon or a biological weapon, that would pass the threshold. That would then mean that the United States or NATO would probably step in and get much more directly involved in this war. So that's absolutely horrifying, to say the least, right? If you're not a big fan of nuclear Armageddon and the end of modern civilization as we know it. So I think that it is a pretty big deal that he is taking this up to the next level. Again, when we're talking about tactical nuclear weapons, I really don't think that that's something that makes any sense, because although there are some nuclear weapons that are lower grade or that would do less immediate damage than some of the larger scale ICBM ones, still, if you use nuclear weapons, what Biden is saying here is that there is no way to guarantee that doesn't set off some sort of a trajectory or a tripwire where then it would continue to escalate back and forth between the United States, NATO, and Russia, where you then could have the broader use of actual more powerful nuclear weapons. So again, I think that it's pretty important that he is coming out and making this distinction here, and not saying that if Vladimir Putin did decide to use these smaller scale nukes, that we would keep our hands off of it, or we would just impose more heavy sanctions or something like that, but that we would actually escalate towards a broader direct use of military power in this ongoing war. So this is a pretty major update here. Now, we've also had some other pretty scary things that have come out over the last couple of days and weeks. So we had this from President Zelensky doing his best impression of Biden here, with just an incredible walkback from an original statement that he put out. So they say here from the Kyiv Independent, President Volodymyr Zelensky said that the West should have carried out preemptive strikes so that Russians would know what will happen to them if they then go and use nuclear weapons. So initially, obviously, anybody who was reading this in good faith would recognize that preemptive strikes probably indicates direct military involvement, right? It seems like a good faith reading of this would mean that Zelensky was calling for NATO or the United States directly to strike some sort of targets in Russia to diminish their ability to carry out nuclear strikes, something along those lines. Now, again, you had this walkback here where they say Zelensky's spokesperson was forced to explain that the president was referring to sanctions, not nuclear weapons. Okay, so not exactly sure what the fuck you mean by that. I think clearly if you were using the term preemptive strikes, that you are not really referring to sanctions, but I guess that it's somewhat of a good thing that he backed off from this. Obviously, I do not think that NATO or the United States should be engaging in strikes directly against Russia, because that would just mean a guarantee that we are devolving into World War III. Now, we also had this update where President Zelensky is saying that he will not negotiate as long as Putin is the president of Russia. So this is also obviously a terrible thing in terms of the prospects for diplomatic negotiations or peace talks. Again, it's one thing to respect Ukrainians' ability to fight and respect their, wanting to expel Russians from the entirety of their territory and maintain their sovereignty that they had before the Russian invasion. Of course, I agree with all of that in theory, right? But when we're talking about what actually needs to happen, there's no indication that Vladimir Putin is going to be deposed from power in any time in the near or distant future. Okay, so you are dealing with the cards that you have on the table, and part of that is that you are inevitably, regardless of how long this war is going to play out, you are inevitably going to have to come to the table with Vladimir Putin, and you are going to have to make some sort of concessions. You are going to have to make some sort of a diplomatic agreement in order to bring the war to an end. The alternative to that is obviously either the war continues indefinitely, the entirety of Ukraine is destroyed, and Russia obviously continues to suffer massive casualties as well, or you risk the potential for this to escalate to direct U.S. involvement or NATO involvement, and escalating this war into essentially World War III. So, there's a couple of different things to say about this. Again, it's not anti-Ukrainian to understand that the interests of what Volodymyr Zelensky wants, the interests of what the Ukrainian people want, does not necessarily 100% line up with the interests of the United States or even the broader world, right? Again, full respect to everybody who wants to fight for your territorial sovereignty. Obviously, I'm not a big fan of Putin, not a big fan of, the Russian government, to say the least. I think that he is a violent imperial war criminal, and so obviously I oppose this invasion. I think in my dream world, obviously Vladimir Putin would just leave the entirety of Ukraine, and that would be the best end to the war, but that's not going to happen, right? Okay, so if we're talking about the real world scenarios, having a situation where Zelensky is not even willing to come to the table, even in theory, to negotiate some sort of a settlement here, that's obviously going to be catastrophic in the long run. So that was another important update that we had here, as well as the request to accelerate the joining of NATO from Ukraine. They did that official application to join the NATO alliance. Now, I've already kind of given my thoughts on that. It's not something that is realistically going to happen. I think that it's actually within the NATO charter that you're not allowed to admit any countries that are in the middle of wars. I don't think that the NATO countries would agree to admit Ukraine right now for obvious reasons. And even if it was accepted in some sort of like a dream scenario for Ukraine, again, that would just mean World War III, which would not necessarily even be better for Ukraine, and definitely not better for the broader global population that doesn't really like the prospects of having to do a nuclear war with the country that has more nukes than any other country on the face of the planet. So there's your update in terms of Ukraine. Now, I think that there were other important points here that they were making in terms of how Russia's underperformance in this war potentially plays in to the need from Putin's perspective to escalate the use of some of these larger weapons. So just a couple of different things that have come out on that recently. We had this article that dropped from Yahoo News just today. Putin allies suggest that Russia's defense minister should kill himself over how badly the Ukraine invasion is going. Okay, so you have close Putin allies who are recognizing that, this war where Vladimir Putin decided initially that he wanted to basically depose of the government of Ukraine, he wanted Zelensky out of power, he wanted to overtake the entirety of the country. That has obviously been a catastrophic failure. Now you have these ongoing successful advances by the Ukrainian armed forces in pushing back Russians in some places up until their own border. And, you have so many different catastrophic failures from the perspective of the Russian military that you now have Putin allies who are suggesting that the defense minister should shoot himself because of how bad this entire operation has been going. Now, I've also seen some articles come out recently diving into some of the details in terms of how corrupt and dysfunctional the Russian military is and their chain of command and all of that. And definitely I think there's a good point to be made there in terms of how, because of how dysfunctional and how corrupt their military operation has been so far, that could potentially lead to this broader escalation, because Putin feels as though the only way that he is going to actually be able to, quote unquote, win this war. I don't think that at the end of this there's going to be any winners in this equation, but from his perspective, the only way that he could possibly win this war would be by escalating towards either nuclear or biological weapons, or some other tactic that a lot of the hard right nationalists within Russia want him to be taking right now. So that was one update that we got. We also got this one, which is another terrifying prospect of how close we actually are to this popping off into World War III. And this is how you know that these recent referendums that Russia was holding to annex portions of Ukraine are just such complete bullshit, right? So here from Newsweek, they say, Russia admits that it doesn't know where its western border is after annexation. Okay, so even Russia, right, after they just held these bullshit referendums within, Donetsk and Kherson and Zaporizhia and, the Donbass region, after they hold these bullshit annexation votes, which are entirely illegitimate for so many different reasons, you can't just hold a referendum vote on joining a different country while you're in the middle of the war, while a lot of these borders are shifting on a day-to-day basis, and after you've just forcefully expelled or killed hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people from these regions, right? Completely illegitimate referendum process that Russia decided to do. But then you have this added layer here where a lot of these regions that they just annexed, in which Putin now claims are part of Russian territory, and therefore by extension, under their nuclear doctrine, would dictate the ability for them to quote unquote defend their own sovereign territory from the perspective of the Russians with nuclear weapons, right? That's part of their doctrine. And here's the terrifying part, is that, you're claiming these different regions of Ukraine as part of Russian territory now, when you yourself don't even know where the fuck the borders are, okay? You don't know exactly where even the territories you just annexed are actually under the control of the Russian troops right now. And, there was that recent liberation of the city of Lyman within Ukraine, and I'm pretty sure that that was actually part of the territory that was included in this annexation. So it's like you have all of these shifting borders. You don't even know whether or not Ukraine is going to be able to retake some of these annexed territories. So coming out here, declaring them part of Russia, updating your nuclear doctrine to say that you have the ability to use those tactical nukes to defend your own territory, this is where it really starts to break down, because there's a lot of confusion. Troops on the ground don't even necessarily know if they're technically within Russia or they're technically within Ukraine. It's just a complete fucking shit show at this point. And this is how close we are to, the prospects of this being escalated. I mean, you have all of these different factors that are compounding on one another. We also had this one, and, sincere fuck you to the New York Times for the paywall here, but just wanted to point out the headline. They say, U.S. lacks a clear picture of Ukraine's war strategy, officials say. They say that intelligence agencies know far more about Russia's military, even as the United States ships billions of dollars in weapons to the Ukrainians. So, I mean, listen, it's one thing to support giving Ukrainians the ability, through weapons or through aid of any sort whatsoever, to defend their own territory, right? I think that most people agree that that is something that we should be doing. Right now, I think the amount that we have been giving them is, absolutely insane at this point. I mean, we have given them tens of billions of dollars in weaponry to continue this ongoing war, with basically not even tying that whatsoever in any way, shape, or form to diplomatic talks or trying to pressure the government to actually try to reach some sort of negotiated settlement. But then we also have this added aspect where, we're giving Ukraine all of this military equipment, right? We basically, the United States as well as the UK, but really the US mainly, have basically been, since the beginning of this war, entirely propping up the entire military operation of the country of Ukraine, right? If it wasn't for this US military aid and the weapons we are giving them, there would be no Ukraine right now, okay? All of their initial weapons that they had at the outset of this invasion have been completely destroyed by this point. So we are simultaneously propping up this continued war effort while also not making pushes for any diplomatic talks whatsoever. You have President Zelensky saying he is in no circumstances going to even think about negotiating with Vladimir Putin, and also we don't even know what their overall strategy is, right? So we're giving them these weapons and we don't even know, they're not telling us what their overall military strategy is or what the actual conditions are on the ground, while we're also giving them intelligence to go out and kill Russian generals, for example, which was a story that we got a couple months ago. The fact that, the United States military, which obviously I'm not a big fan of, to say the least, but that's a different conversation, but the idea that like our own intelligence agencies, our own military know more about the Russian military strategy because of all of our extensive spy networks there and the history that we have with Russia, we know more about the Russian military strategy than we do about the Ukrainian military strategy, which we are propping up. That to me is completely insane. We, at least if we are going to, risk this escalation, if we are going to risk continuing this in the trajectory that it is on right now, we at least deserve to know what the fuck is going on the ground, right? What is actually the strategy that Ukrainians are deploying? We also had an interesting update on that that story that broke a couple of weeks ago, I guess a month ago at this point, saying that apparently United States military officials do think that it was Ukrainian-backed forces that conducted that assassination of Alexander Dughin's daughter within Russia. This high-ranking, or not high-ranking because he's not officially part of the military, but this very well-known guy within Russia Russia, who was like a ultra hard right nationalist who is apparently very influential on Vladimir Putin's strategy towards all of these things. And they essentially attempting to assassinate him, actually ended up killing his daughter. Basically, we now know that, according to the United States military, that it was Ukrainians doing that operation. So that's another escalation that you got to keep in the back of your mind. The fact that, Ukraine is launching assassination plots within Russian territory, within their capital of Moscow. And, we don't even know that that's taking place, right? You're killing civilians within Russian cities. So that's another escalation. Now, of course, again, I don't want people to get the idea that I'm somehow like against Ukrainians continuing to fight to liberate their territories and expel Russian troops from them. That's completely fine. I'm on board with that. But we have to actually know the parameters of this, right? We have to know where these weapons are going. We have to know what the overall strategy is here, not just militarily, but also on a diplomatic front. We have this weird idea now within the minds of the American people, or especially within the mind of Joe Biden, that like you can just take a hands-off approach to this. No, absolutely not, okay? We are basically propping up the entirety of the Ukrainian military. We have to have some sort of a coherent grand strategy here for what the end of this war looks like. And now, obviously, there's a lot of other pressures here. You have the military-industrial complex that's been profiting to the tune of billions of dollars off of the continuation of this war. We've talked about Boris Johnson sort of putting his thumb on the scale when there were those initial prospects for peace talks that were happening. He said the West is not done with this war. We know all of these factors that are playing into this, the military-industrial complex here in the United States wanting to continue this war. But I mean, it just seems like there's such an underappreciation going on right now, not just within the United States, but around the world in terms of how catastrophic this could be, right? Because obviously you feel sympathy for the people of Ukraine that have been killed, for the people of Ukraine that have been, tortured and expelled from their homes and having their sovereign territory invaded by this force that is the Russian military. Obviously you have sympathy for that, but you have to have some sort of a grand strategy here, and you have to aggressively be pushing for some sort of a negotiated settlement at the end of the day, right? This is not something that is just going to end realistically with Vladimir Putin tucking his tail between his legs and, walking out of Ukrainian territory. Obviously, everybody would love to see that happen, but it's not going to happen. He's significantly more likely to escalate this toward a broader conflict or to escalate this towards the use of nuclear weapons. And given the statements that we just got from Joe Biden, it appears like, at least possibly, that that would provoke a response directly from the U.S. military or from NATO allies. So, I mean, this is something that, we really have to be having much more deeper conversations. And it's just absolutely bizarre to me that, the degrees to which we are seeing manufacturing consent happen right now, where it's like, if you are even questioning, the military aid that we are giving to Ukraine, if you are even questioning, what are the prospects of diplomatic talks that could potentially be on the table in the future, if you are questioning any of this, then you're labeled as like a Putin apologist or a Putin propagandist. It's completely fucking ridiculous, right? My priority at the end of the day, as I think is the priority of many people around the world, is number one, obviously, in, the best case scenario, you want Ukraine to be fully liberated. You want them to remain, with their sovereign territory that they had before the invasion. But also, the priority here is not escalating this towards a global nuclear war, not escalating this towards the potential of World War III, because that would be much more disastrous, not just for the Ukrainian people, but for the entire fucking future of the planet.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying